A little tip for compressing elements with the drums. I like to find out the frequency of where the punch of my kick and my snare are, then use a multiband compressor to just take that short frequency range out of the element that I'm sidechaining. So for example, if my snare has the punch about 200 Hertz, I'll use a multiband compressor to dip the 200 Hertz range so that that snare will come through the mix without dipping the whole volume of the element that we're sidechaining against. So for the bass line, I tend to write my sub or the melody of my bass first before getting into any synthesis whatsoever. And then I'll create multiple instances of Serum or Massive or whatever synth that I'm using for the bass. And then change envelopes, maybe change the wavetables, change a little bit of distortion. And what I like to do is I'll take the MIDI clip, which has the entire bass line written into it. Then I'll chop up that MIDI clip and move the individual notes or groups of notes to the different synths that I've created. So in regards to the processing of the bass is being sidechained with the kick and the snare, so that the kick and the snare punch through. So the main bass is actually just a plain old square wave. The bass is also run through a guitar amp or a distortion plugin, and then saturated, which I believe I did with the J37, which is a Waves plugin. It's fantastic. And then I've used an exciter, which is the Aphex Vintage Exciter, also a Waves plugin. And then on top of this, I've layered a formant square to give a real gritty high end to my main bass. There's a separate sub, which is something that I tend to do for most of my tracks. I'll roll off my synthesized bass lines at around 100 Hertz and then EQ my sub so that it's only coming from 100 Hertz down. This way I've got a lot more control. As for the sound space, I've kept most of my bass line pretty centralized with my kick and my snare. The formant square has been widened just to give the bass a little bit more of a depth and a width. I've slightly panned the hi-hat and some of the percussion, both left and right, to give it a little bit of width to the drums too. I tend to use the S1 imager from Waves. I tried to give a lot of width to my effects. There's a few risers, some sinks, some lasers, and an explosion. And I tried to give it a little bit of width to these just so that it livened up the whole track. It's really important to give space for everything, not only in your frequency range, but when you're creating your stereo imaging too. The things that I'd say to new producers are, a lot of people get really caught up in having the right hardware, having these specific monitors, having a hardware synth, or having this piece of software. And at the end of the day, what's really important is the idea and the vibe and the groove of the track. Mixing down and synthesis is really something that you can learn along the way. There's a lot of tutorials, but unless you're doing something that you're passionate about and that you really care about and you're feeling the vibe of, the track's never going to take off. So to me, what's important is keeping the vibe and the feeling of the track, something that you're proud of, and making the most of what you've got. Another really important thing for me is sending my stuff to people who I respect and that I know have a really good understanding of production, and taking constructive criticism. I don't want to send a track to someone for them to just come back and say, yeah man, that's dope. That's the worst piece of feedback that you can get, in my opinion. If someone says, yeah, that's dope, but I think you could work on this, fantastic. I think it's really important in the writing process to not be too precious. If you need to scrap something in your track that's not making the track work, even if you're really proud of it, it's important to get rid of that element. Even if you've got the greatest snare, if it's not working for the track, it's not the greatest snare. Everything has to be in context.
And now for a complete playthrough of xrayted's edit of Tanya Stephens' 2004 tune, It's a Pity.